In the closing months of 1943, as the long-range bombing campaign against the Reich intensified, Luftwaffe commanders still believed they possessed one decisive advantage. It was dangerous for American bombers to reach deep into Germany because no Allied escort fighter could accompany them all the way from England to targets like Leipzig, Schweinfurt, or Berlin. The Bf-109G and FW-190A might have been stretched thin, their experienced aces dying faster than they could be replaced, but as long as the bombers had to fly the last 300 miles alone, the Jagdwaffe could still tear them apart. Then, without warning, a fighter appeared on the horizon that immediately shattered every assumption the Luftwaffe held about the air war. It was sleek, long-legged, and frighteningly fast, unlike anything the Germans had seen before. Its name was the P-51 Mustang, and when it first reached the high-altitude cold blue over northwest Germany in December 1943, everything changed. The early signs disturbed even hardened German veterans. Reports from JG-1 and JG-26 described a new American fighter that could climb with the best Bf-109 G6s, roll with surprising quickness, and, most unsettling of all, continue to escort the heavy bombers long after the usual point where Allied fighters turned home. Luftwaffe controllers initially dismissed the sightings as misidentifications of P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings. But pilots insisted the aircraft was different. It was faster, pursuing German formations at full throttle and still closing the gap. Independent reports from multiple Gruppen confirmed the same chilling observation. This fighter could dive like a stone, yet climb back with alarming energy, characteristics neither the 109 nor 190 had seen from an American type. The truth emerged quickly in January 1944, when Mustang groups began flying deep penetration escort missions. The aircraft's arrival was the result of a transformation months in the making. The British had designed the original Mustang in 1940, but when the Americans replaced its Allison engine with a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, complete with two-stage, two-speed supercharger, its performance skyrocketed. Suddenly, the Mustang could maintain power above 25,000 feet, matching or surpassing the altitude performance of the Bf-109, while retaining high-speed stability the German fighter lacked. More importantly, with its new 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B possessed the one capability the Luftwaffe feared most: true long-range escort. The Mustang could fly all the way to central Germany, fight, and return home. This alone represented a strategic disaster the Germans had never prepared for. Johannes Steinhoff later wrote bitterly that, "The moment we realized the Mustangs could stay with the bombers to the end, we knew the war in the air was lost." Adolf Galland, then General der Jagdflieger, echoed this shock, calling the P-51 the most dangerous Allied fighter of them all. He understood the implication immediately. Once American fighters could protect their bombers throughout the entire mission, the Luftwaffe would lose its last advantage. On the first deep escort missions, German pilots attempted their usual tactic, waiting until the escorts turned for home, then diving on the exposed bomber formations. But on January 11, 1944, over Oschersleben, they discovered to their horror that the escorts no longer turned back. P-51Bs from the 354th Fighter Group stayed glued to the formation, meeting the first attack wave of JG-11 head-on at high altitude. The 109s expected the Americans to peel away due to fuel limits. Instead, the Mustangs pursued them aggressively, climbing after them with energy the German pilots did not expect. For the first time, German formations were forced into defensive avoidance maneuvers before even reaching the bombers. Pilots reported Mustangs diving on them from above, firing accurately at long range with 6.50 caliber Brownings, whose velocity and reach exceeded the standard MG-131, or the slower-firing 20mm MG-151 cannon. German staff analyses noted something even more alarming. The P-51 retained energy in high-altitude turns almost as well as the 109, but thanks to its laminar flow wing and superior dive acceleration, it could switch from defensive to offensive positions far more rapidly. The Mustangs also displayed superior endurance. German pilots who attempted to break away by performing long, shallow dives discovered the P-51 closing in again minutes later, still behind them, still fast, still climbing, still hunting. This was the moment many Luftwaffe Gruppen realized the truth. The Americans had finally produced a fighter capable of dominating high-altitude intercept battles from start to finish. By February 1944, as USAF began conducting systematic attacks in preparation for Big Week, the psychological effect of the Mustang intensified. Luftwaffe radio intercept operators heard frantic reports of P-51s appearing over Brunswick, Magdeburg, and even near Berlin. To German commanders, this meant one thing: there was now no sanctuary in the Reich's airspace. The old expectation that Allied fighters would abandon the bombers and turn home was now obsolete. Steinhoff later described the realization as like watching the walls close in. With each mission, the Mustang became not just another fighter, but a symbol of American industrial and technological superiority. Its presence meant that bomber formations would no longer suffer catastrophic losses. It meant that the Luftwaffe could no longer rely on timing or altitude to their advantage. And worst of all, it meant that German fighter wings, already crippled by losses in Russia, Africa, and Italy, would now have to fight American fighters at full strength every single time. The Mustang did not win the air war on its first appearance, but the day it arrived, Luftwaffe commanders sensed the future. They saw a fighter fast enough to chase their interceptors, high-flying enough to meet them where they once reigned, and with range long enough to accompany the bombers to the beating heart of Germany. From that moment on, no German strategist, no matter how optimistic, could deny the truth. The P-51 Mustang was the most dangerous adversary the Luftwaffe had ever faced, and it had only just begun its campaign of dominance. By early 1944, as the P-51B and later the P-51D flooded into the 8th Air Force, Luftwaffe commanders found themselves confronting a brutal truth no propaganda could disguise. Germany's two frontline fighters, the Bf-109G and FW-190A, were no longer superior to the newest American escort fighter. In almost every measurable category, speed, climb, dive, range, firepower, and high-altitude performance, the Mustang held an advantage. And even where the German machines remained competitive, the Mustang's overall energy retention and endurance rendered those advantages tactically irrelevant. For a Luftwaffe already stretched thin, this wasn't just a technical problem, it was a strategic death blow. The first shock came in speed. The Bf-109 G6, the backbone of the Jagdwaffe in 1943, topped out at roughly 398 to 404 miles per hour, depending on altitude. The FW-190A6 could reach around 407 miles per hour. The Mustang, with its Packard-built Merlin V1650-3, hit 440 miles per hour, not in a dive, but level at altitude. German pilots described the alarming moment when their full-throttle escape dives were overtaken by Mustangs still accelerating behind them. The FW-190A, once feared for its blistering dive rate, could not shake a P-51. Pilots of JG-54 and JG-26 reported that Mustangs closed even in steep dives, something no Allied fighter had done before. But speed alone was not what terrified the German high command. It was altitude performance. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy depended on the ability of Bf-109 interceptors to climb rapidly and reach bomber formations before they neared critical targets. Yet the P-51B and P-51D were designed specifically to dominate the high-altitude flight envelope where B-17s and B-24s flew. Their two-stage, two-speed superchargers kept airflow and power consistent above 25,000 feet, allowing them to fight on equal or superior terms with the Bf-109 G6, whose high-altitude engine performance deteriorated sharply without MW-50 or specialized high-altitude variants. Even the later 109 G10 and 109 K4 could not negate the Mustang's combination of altitude power and diving superiority. German pilots were stunned to discover that Mustangs were often waiting for them above the bomber stream. That alone broke the Luftwaffe's preferred tactic. Jagdgeschwader units traditionally attacked from above, diving through the bomber formations to exploit speed and surprise. But when Mustangs took up high cover, the 109s were forced into the unfamiliar and deadly role of climbing into superior enemy fighters. Then came the dive problem. The Bf-109 and FW-190 both had structural and compressibility limits that forced pilots to pull out earlier and more carefully. The Mustang, thanks to its laminar flow wing, powerful engine, and robust construction, could dive faster and recover more predictably. German pilots attempting vertical disengagements, an escape method that had worked against P-47s and P-38s, found Mustangs still glued to their tails. As Galland later admitted, the Mustang could choose to fight or not fight. We no longer had that choice. The Mustang's firepower also contributed to the widening gap. Its 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns had a long, effective range, high velocity, and exceptional reliability, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds that ripped through German aircraft fuel tanks and oil coolers. Meanwhile, the Bf-109 G6's nose-mounted MG-131s were less accurate in deflection shooting, and although the MG-151-20 cannon packed a punch, it fired slowly and had less reach. As engagements shifted to higher speeds and longer firing distances, conditions favoring deflection shooting, the American armament system proved decisively superior. But perhaps the most demoralizing advantage was range. The Luftwaffe had never faced an Allied fighter that could pursue them deep into their own airspace, fight multiple engagements, and still escort bombers home. The Mustang's external tanks allowed it to fly more than 1,500 miles. That meant the old German tactic of shadowing the bomber stream until the escorts turned back was now impossible. Mustangs did not turn back. They stayed. They followed the 109s home. They destroyed stragglers. They jumped takeoff and landing patterns. They attacked airfields. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. This endurance also reshaped the tactical rhythm of engagements. German pilots frequently entered combat low on fuel, their short-legged 109Gs forced to launch, climb, fight, and land, all within a narrow operational window. Mustang groups, by contrast, arrived with enough fuel to fight aggressively. They could climb hard, dive hard, and chase fleeing Germans without worrying about crossing the point of no return. The psychological effect was devastating. Luftwaffe leaders watched their pilots become more cautious, while Mustang pilots grew more aggressive. Young German flyers, rushed through shortened training programs, were immediately thrown into fights with veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. Losses mounted rapidly, and each loss carried greater weight. Germany could not replace pilots. America could, and did. By the spring of 1944, the performance gap had become a chasm. The Luftwaffe still fielded excellent machines, the Bf-109K4, the 190D9, even the jet-powered Me-262, but none existed in numbers large enough to counter the sheer volume of Mustangs now operating over the Reich. Worse, these late-war German aircraft were often forced to fight at a disadvantage: low fuel, limited spare parts, inexperienced replacements, and the ever-present threat of P-51s lurking overhead. The Mustang's dominance was not accidental. It was the culmination of Allied industrial power, aerodynamic innovation, and a fighter doctrine built around escort supremacy. It was designed to do more than defeat the German fighters. It was designed to eliminate the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. And by early 1944, as the performance mismatch widened, Luftwaffe commanders knew they were fighting an opponent not just superior, but overwhelming in every dimension. The Mustang was not simply better in one area, it was better everywhere that mattered. And for the Luftwaffe, that meant the end of their ability to control the skies over Germany. By the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become the central weapon of a new American strategy, the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Before the Mustang, U.S. commanders had been trapped in a grim equation. Deep raids into Germany meant catastrophic bomber losses. And even when P-47s and P-38s pushed deeper, Luftwaffe interceptors could still wait for a window, strike, and escape. The Mustang erased that window completely. It was fast enough to pursue German fighters during their attack runs, long-ranged enough to escort bombers the entire way to their targets, and powerful enough to chase retreating aircraft all the way back to their bases. The moment these capabilities converged, the strategic foundation of the Luftwaffe began to collapse. The most important shift the Mustang introduced was what Galland later called the American freedom to hunt. Instead of reacting to German attacks, P-51 pilots began aggressively taking the initiative, performing fighter sweeps ahead of the bombers. This tactic forced Luftwaffe units to scramble early, often before assembling in cohesive formations. Gruppen that once attacked in massed waves now found themselves broken apart in the climb, hit by Mustangs as they formed up. Bombers, meanwhile, benefited from the thinning of enemy ranks even before reaching the target area. The Mustang also revolutionized the escort role by performing split escort tactics, in which one element flew close cover around the bombers while another roamed high above or far ahead. This created overlapping protective layers the Germans struggled to penetrate. A Bf-109 attempting to reach the bomber stream first had to evade the top cover Mustangs at 28,000 to 30,000 feet. If it slipped through, it then had to survive the close escorts circling the bombers themselves. And if a German pilot tried to disengage, he often ran straight into another roaming Mustang group positioned along the Luftwaffe's retreat routes. However, the most devastating shift came when U.S. commanders realized that with Mustangs guarding the bombers, they no longer needed every fighter to stay tied to close escort duty. Increasing numbers of P-51s were unleashed as free-roaming air superiority hunters. Their mission was simple: find the Luftwaffe anywhere, airfields, assembly zones, low-level routes, or even training areas, and destroy it. Mustang groups began hitting German fighters before the battle even started. They strafed airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They caught 109s and 190s warming up on runways. They intercepted replacements fresh from flight school. They attacked training flights. They hunted stragglers returning with empty tanks. They pounced on damaged German fighters that had barely survived combat with bombers. For the Luftwaffe, this created a nightmare cycle. Every sortie was dangerous from takeoff to landing. By mid-1944, the Mustang was not simply defeating the Luftwaffe, it was bleeding it to death, as Galland later admitted. The effect on pilot attrition was catastrophic. Germany entered 1944 already short of veteran aviators after years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. Before the Mustang arrived, they could preserve some experienced pilots by disengaging early or retreating beyond Allied escort range. Once the Mustang arrived, those escape routes vanished. A German ace who escaped combat over Magdeburg or Leipzig might still be chased 50 miles, 100 miles, even 150 miles on the return leg by Mustangs that refused to let go. Young, undertrained pilots fared even worse. The Luftwaffe had already shortened training programs drastically, down to just a few dozen flight hours in some cases, while American pilots accumulated hundreds of hours in combat aircraft before deployment. Now these inexperienced German flyers were forced to fight elite Mustang groups, such as the 357th, 4th, 5th, and 352nd Fighter Groups, whose pilots frequently entered combat with vastly superior training, better teamwork, and a fighter that excelled in every phase of aerial combat. One German report from JG 300 described Mustang sweeps as a scythe cutting through ripened wheat. Another chilling entry from JG1 noted, "We no longer lose aircraft, we lose pilots, and we cannot replace them." The Mustang also played a decisive role in destroying the Luftwaffe's infrastructure. During Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, P-51s roamed ahead of the bomber streams in massive numbers. They tore through interceptors scrambling to lift off from central German bases. They strafed runways, fuel dumps, and dispersal areas. Even when outnumbered, Mustangs maintained energy advantage, turning German bases into deadly traps. Steinhoff, commanding JG-77 in Italy, and later involved in planning for Reich defense, admitted that Big Week marked the turning point because the Mustang allowed bombers to reach German aircraft factories without prohibitive losses. The Americans destroyed engine production centers, assembly plants, and repair depots, crippling Germany's ability to produce or maintain fighters. The cumulative effect was fatal. Luftwaffe Gruppen that once fielded 40 to 50 operational aircraft now struggled to put up 12. Entire fighter wings evaporated within months. Hitler demanded counteroffensives in the air, but the numbers were no longer there. Germany had the technical ability to build advanced fighters like the 109 T-4, 190 D-9, and jet-powered Me-262, but lacked pilots, fuel, spare parts, and surviving airfields to use them effectively. The Mustang ensured that any new aircraft were hunted down the moment they appeared. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command understood the horrifying reality. The air war was lost not in one battle, but in the relentless attrition imposed by P-51 Hunting groups. The Mustang had flipped the strategic balance completely. Instead of defending German skies, the Luftwaffe was fighting for its life, bleeding from every mission, every scramble, every attempted interception. The Mustang was more than just a better fighter. It was the perfect weapon to dismantle an air force already stretched to the breaking point. It hunted early, it hunted late, it hunted everywhere. And by the time the Wehrmacht faced the Allied invasion in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was so weakened that it could barely lift 100 fighters to oppose the landings. The Mustang did not merely escort bombers. It choked the Luftwaffe, crushed its pilot corps, shattered its infrastructure, and left Germany's skies wide open. And the commanders who had once believed they could outlast the Americans now understood the truth. The Luftwaffe was dying, and the Mustang was the executioner. By February 1944, the Luftwaffe was already staggering from the relentless pressure imposed by the P-51 sweeps, but the real collapse had not yet begun. That final blow came during the 6 days that American commanders codenamed Operation Argument, but which Luftwaffe pilots would remember bitterly as Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched massive coordinated raids against the German aircraft industry, while P-51 Mustangs provided the deep escort that had once been impossible. Until that moment, German commanders believed that even if their fighter force was under strain, the Reich's vast industrial base could still produce the next generation of interceptors that would turn the air war around. Big Week destroyed that illusion. What made Big Week uniquely devastating was not simply the damage inflicted on engine plants and aircraft factories, but the way Mustangs dismantled the Luftwaffe's entire defensive posture. The strategic goal was straightforward: force the Luftwaffe to rise and fight, then kill it faster than it could regenerate. The P-51 made this strategy viable. Previously, German fighters could wait for the escorts to depart, strike the bombers, and then withdraw. Now, Mustangs escorted bomber formations all the way from England into Germany's industrial heartland and remained overhead throughout every phase of the battle. Every time a German fighter rose to defend its homeland, it had to fight Mustangs first. The Germans had no tactical advantage, no window, no altitude band, no moment of sanctuary. Steinhoff later wrote, "We fought from disadvantage before the battle even began." During Big Week, the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of fighters destroyed, dozens of experienced pilots killed, and many more forced to bail out over Allied-controlled territory. The attrition was so severe that several Jagdgeschwader recorded operational readiness rates below 35% within days. And the aircraft factories they were defending, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Gotha, Halberstadt, were left smoking ruins. Even worse, America lost far fewer bombers than the Luftwaffe had predicted. The Mustangs had changed everything. Then the Americans did something that shook the Luftwaffe to its core. They flew straight to Berlin. In March 1944, the first escorted raids on Berlin took place, marking a psychological turning point as profound as it was tactical. Hitler had promised the German people that the capital was safe, that the Luftwaffe would never allow bombers to reach the city in strength. But on March 6th, nearly 700 bombers and more than 800 escort fighters, including hundreds of P-51Bs and P-51Ds, flew into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe tried to stop them. Nearly every available fighter wing was thrown into the defense, but wherever the Germans climbed, Mustangs were already there. The air battle raged at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, with swirling contrails marking the violent struggle. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s attempted head-on attacks, their only remaining tactic against the American formations, but they were cut down by Mustangs that pounced from above and behind. Even when German pilots managed to break through the wall of escorts, they found themselves with no safe escape route. The Mustang's range meant that any 109 or 190 attempting to dive away was pursued deep into the east or far to the west, caught and shot down. German loss reports for the Berlin raids read like obituaries. What stunned Luftwaffe command most was not just the loss of aircraft, but the loss of experience. Pilots who had survived years on the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean, and the Western Front were now being overwhelmed by American fighters flown by young, aggressive pilots in a superior machine. A single week of combat could erase an entire Staffel's worth of veterans. The Land, who spent much of this period trying to rebuild the Reich's defenses, later admitted, "The quality of our fighter force fell to pieces." As attrition soared, a new problem emerged: fuel. Allied strategic bombing against synthetic fuel plants, combined with Mustang sweeps that destroyed tanker trucks, storage tanks, and refineries, left the Luftwaffe starved for aviation gasoline. Many units were grounded or forced to ration flight hours so severely that new pilots received almost no training. Meanwhile, American pilots accumulated hundreds of hours in combat before rotating home. Even the introduction of advanced German fighters could not reverse the trend. The Bf-109K4 and FW-190D9 were superb aircraft, capable of challenging the Mustang at certain altitudes, but they arrived in tiny numbers and were flown mostly by inexperienced pilots. The Me-262 jet, which Galland believed could restore German air superiority, was hamstrung by Hitler's insistence that it serve as a bomber, and by the fact that Mustangs prowled around every jet airfield, waiting to catch the Me-262s during takeoff and landing, its most vulnerable moments. No matter what the Luftwaffe deployed, the P-51 was there to counter it. By the summer of 1944, as Allied troops prepared to invade Normandy, the once fearsome Jagdwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of itself. Many groupings could barely put up a dozen aircraft. Others were grounded altogether. When D-Day arrived, the Luftwaffe was so weakened that it could mount only sporadic, symbolic resistance. One of the most infamous moments of the day came when only 2 German fighters, flown by Priller and Klaproth, made a brief strafing run over the beaches. It was a shocking contrast to 1940, when the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies of Europe. The Mustang had made this transformation possible. It allowed American bombers to strike anywhere, escorted from start to finish. It eliminated German fighters in the air, on the ground, during takeoff, or during landing. It destroyed the pilot corps, strangled the fuel supply, shattered training programs, and left Germany's industrial heart exposed. By the end of 1944, Luftwaffe commanders no longer feared the Mustang because it was a superior fighter. They feared it because it symbolized the end of their war. Wherever they flew, the P-51 was already waiting. And wherever the Mustang appeared, the Luftwaffe disappeared.
By 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become more than just an Allied fighter. It had become the embodiment of a reality the Luftwaffe had once believed impossible: the total loss of control over the skies above Germany. For the Jagdwaffe, the Mustang was not feared simply because it was faster, or because it flew farther, or because it dove harder. It was feared because it destroyed the very foundation of German air power. It dismantled the fighter force in the air, wiped out its pilots on the ground, strangled its fuel supply, decimated its industry, and erased the Luftwaffe's ability to contest any part of the air war. When Luftwaffe commanders like Galland and Steinhoff recalled the Mustang as the most feared Allied fighter, they were speaking not of a single characteristic, but of an entire strategic reality that the P-51 made unavoidable. At the tactical level, the Mustang was the perfect predator. It possessed the ideal combination of speed, altitude performance, climb rate, dive acceleration, maneuverability, and range. In a dogfight, it could fight vertically or horizontally. Against a Bf-109, it could use energy tactics. Against an FW-190, it could turn tighter at higher speeds. Against Me-262 jets, it could loiter around airfields and ambush them during takeoff or landing. Its 6.50 caliber Brownings gave it a killing reach that few German pilots could escape. In pilot memoirs, German veterans often described a chilling moment when they realized that escaping the Mustang's guns was nearly impossible, not just because the aircraft was superior, but because the American pilot behind those guns had the fuel and the confidence to pursue them for dozens of miles. The Mustang was feared because it did not let go. But beyond its performance envelope, what truly made the Mustang terrifying to Luftwaffe leadership was its strategic impact. Before 1944, the Luftwaffe could still dream of regaining control of the air by inflicting crippling losses on unescorted or partially escorted bomber formations. After the arrival of the P-51, that dream died. American bombers could reach oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, engine plants, and aircraft assembly lines deep inside the Reich, and they could reach them without suffering catastrophic losses. Every time a Mustang escorted a bomber group over a target previously deemed unreachable, the strategic picture shifted further against Germany. The Mustang made the Reich small. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. This led directly to the collapse of Germany's economic core. Oil production shrank, training schools lost aircraft, replacement engines went unbuilt, spare parts became impossible to obtain. As Mustang sweeps intensified, they targeted everything that kept the Luftwaffe alive: runways, rail lines, repair depots, fuel trains, and maintenance workshops. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was not merely losing battles, it was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. For the pilots and commanders who lived through this collapse, the psychological impact was profound. In 1941 and 1942, Luftwaffe aces had fought from a position of superiority. Their aircraft were faster than many opponents, their tactics refined, their training unmatched. But by 1944, they found themselves flying from bomb-cratered runways in aircraft assembled from mismatched parts, with fuel rations so tight that some groupmen were limited to a single hour of flying time per pilot per month. Against this backdrop, the Mustang soared overhead in vast numbers, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training, backed by a supply chain so deep that losing dozens of aircraft made no difference to American operational tempo. This disparity turned every engagement into a psychological defeat before the first shot was fired. German pilots often took off knowing they were outnumbered, outtrained, and outfought. They flew missions as much out of duty as hope. Johannes Steinhoff confessed that by late 1944, I felt the sense of dread every time I saw them. The Mustangs were always above us, always waiting. The Mustang's legacy also lies in the collapse of the Luftwaffe's veteran corps. The loss of experienced aces such as Egon Meyer, Walter Ausau, Emil Lang, and countless others weakened the Jagdwaffe beyond repair. Many died in combat with Mustangs, others perished in bomber interception attempts that would have been survivable earlier in the war. As the Luftwaffe lost these irreplaceable pilots, a younger generation, often with as little as 20 to 30 flying hours, was sent to face battle-hardened Mustang groups. For the Americans, this phase of the war resembled a grim harvest. For the Germans, it was a tragedy unfolding in real time. When historians look back at the European air war, they often focus on the B-17, the B-24, and the strategic bombing campaign. But even Allied commanders admitted that without the P-51, the bomber offensive might never have succeeded. General Karl Spaatz once remarked that the Mustang did more to bring about Germany's defeat than any other aircraft in the 8th Air Force. Eisenhower himself echoed the sentiment, stating that the Mustang was a war-winning weapon. These were not exaggerations. They were statements from leaders who witnessed firsthand how the P-51 reshaped the battlefield. By 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, the proud Jagdwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1939 to 1941, was effectively gone. Its remnants fought bravely, but bravery could not reverse the laws of energy, altitude, speed, or fuel shortages. The Mustang ruled the sky, and Germany could no longer oppose it. The P-51 had turned the offensive campaign in Europe into an unstoppable force, allowing bombers to annihilate the Reich's industrial base and clearing the way for Allied armies on the ground. In the end, the reason Luftwaffe commanders feared the Mustang more than any other Allied fighter was simple. It represented not just an aircraft, but the end of their world. It symbolized the shift from offensive dominance to permanent, irreversible defeat. It was the instrument that stripped away their last advantages, the blade that cut down their best pilots, the shadow that hung over every airfield, and the guarantee that the Reich skies would never again belong to Germany. To the German pilots who fought it, the P-51 Mustang was not just a machine, it was the harbinger of collapse, the aircraft that arrived when the Luftwaffe still hoped for victory and remained until that hope was gone forever.